Welcome on into the Fantasy Football Forge. My name is Steve, and it is time to go over the quarterback and tight end position preview video. If you did not catch them, wide receiver, running back preview videos were already presented earlier on in the week, so go check those out. You can find them, of course, on my channel. If I remember to, I will put a link to each of them in the description down below. A couple of quick announcements. The entirety of next week, I will be going live each day is the plan leading up to Labor Day weekend, and over the weekend I plan on being quite available, and I will be here doing live mock drafts, so here available to help you guys get some more practice in before your actual drafts occur. Labor Day weekend being the most popular weekend for drafts. So in concert with that, I will also be releasing my final rankings videos, but you don't need to wait for the video if you don't want, or if your drafts happen earlier. You can go up onto my website, www.theFFforge.com, link down in the description if you must, and on the website, click up top here on the rankings, and you can see my most recent rankings. Later on, I might talk a little bit about the fact that some of the information in this video is based on analyses that I did years ago, and that can be found here in the articles tab. full-PPR tight end analysis, or I think general is going to have the quarterback positional analysis. And going back to the rankings too, if you want a printable draft sheet, this has my rankings, my most recent rankings, averaged out along with the most recent ADP. If you're going to be drafting this weekend, just wait till like Saturday morning before printing it off, best case scenario. But this is obviously a cheat sheet that you can go cross off, and as I always advise that you go through it ahead of time and, you know, go highlight asterisk next to whatever players that you think are too low so they catch your eye. There's that. Also, I've done some videos on player highlight series. There is the list of the players that I have covered while doing that series. If you have any disagreements with where these guys are typically being taken in your drafts, check out these videos. They're supposed to be relatively quick, and in each one you can find out, are they getting taken too low in drafts, too high in drafts, or are they just, is the ADP just right? That's the Goldilocks, baby. And I think that is going to cover most everything in this video. I will be doing it's mostly going to be comparing and contrasting the quarterbacks to the tight end position in order to figure out which one we would more likely take higher in the draft. That's going to be a fair bit of the argument here, but also looking at how we're going to be drafting these positions, the quarterback position and the tight end position. Strategy at the end of the, I'll tell you, how many of each tier I want of the positions and what my strategy is for the drafts of these positions. Looking at injuries, how that might impact the health of these positions, and once again, does that impact how likely you are to draft them or not, to rely on them. Some historical information and looking at specific information based on this year's draft. Of course, looking at some targets, busts, sleepers, those kinds of guys throughout each of the tiers that I will break down while looking at the average draft positions of players. So let's just start out looking at some comparisons between the two. Looking at the tier 1 comparisons, there's going to be 2 tiers for each of these positions because that's just kind of how things work out. Now, if you do go to the articles and you look at those that are up on my website, you may notice that there's going to be some difference between these tiers. That was based on 1 year of data. I went back for this video specifically, looked at the last couple of years of data, and came up with a little bit of a conglomerate based on that historical information still to create these tiers for this video. Also thinking about specifically how the tight end position has evolved over the past 3 years. It's a little bit different coming into this season. So, tier 1 quarterbacks, I figure there's about 2 to 5 players that are going to be, these are your difference makers. That's the guys that separate themselves from the rest of the crowd, from the rest of the position, usually in a bigger way than you can find at any other point in the position. That's true of like every position. So here, the weekly expectation for the quarterback position, 20 plus fantasy points. Basically, when you look at your team, you're just like, all right, so I can get 20 points from my quarterback at a minimum, blah, 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 when you're just kind of trying to figure out maybe if you're going to be able to beat your opponent or not. For the average advantage across the entirety of the season, it's going to be about 4.5 fantasy points, what that really looks like in each individual week across the entirety of the season is that these guys are going to should give you an advantage against most any opponent outside of their own tier of 0 to 10.5 fantasy points. For the tight end position, looking at a little bit of a bigger pool of players here, 4 to 7 tight ends making up this first tier, the weekly expectations being 8+ fantasy points. So you look at your guy and you say, I know you're good for 8 fantasy points. You're not going to score less than that. But what's interesting when we compare these positions against one another is the average advantage that these Tier 1 quarterbacks are giving you against the rest of the pool. The average advantage that these Tier 1 tight ends are giving you against the rest of the tight end pool. Against the own position, it's the same. It's a net 0 advantage in either scenario, really. You're not getting a better advantage by drafting a Tier 1 quarterback than you are getting by drafting a Tier 1 tight end. And to finish that up, deficit of 2 points to an advantage of 12.5 fantasy points is what you're expecting on a weekly basis. So when we look at these things, the top tier quarterbacks may be more rare. Not a guarantee. There's a little bit of an overlap there. But I think that that's definitely going to be true of this season. So advantage to the Tier 1 quarterback in terms of rarity. And, rarity means that you typically want to hold that rare value that nobody else has or fewer others have. The average advantage is about the same as I pointed out. And with that in mind, that means that the weekly fantasy point expectation there really doesn't matter, because either way, it's what's the advantage against your opponent is what determines if you win, whether it's 20 fantasy points or 8 fantasy points. If you're beating your opponent by 4, then that is the lead that you have against your opponent. Whether it's because you scored 8 fantasy points and your opponent scored 4, or because you scored 20 fantasy points and your opponent scored 16. Doesn't really matter. But the biggest thing here is that what we're seeing is that the bottom numbers there, 0 to 10.5, -2 to 12.5 fantasy point matchup advantage numbers, meaning that the tight end is more boom or bust. We're going to see this come up more in this video, and the quarterback is more consistent at the top of the tiers via the matchup advantage. And so once again, that is going to be advantage towards the Tier 1 quarterbacks. So in 2 of these sectors that we looked at, advantage goes to the Tier 1 quarterback. I'm saying advantage to taking a Tier 1 quarterback when we are just specifically looking at Tier 1 quarterbacks versus Tier 1 tight ends. But there's more to the story. Remember, you got to build an entirety of a roster, and when you take something, you're giving something else up. All right, so here are the Tier 2 quarterbacks and tight ends. I've kind of looked at each of these already, so they're on the screen for you to compare and contrast as I just go over where the advantages lie. So there's no clear advantage on rarity. It's more likely that there is some tight end rarity for the Tier 2 tight ends, so we'll say slight advantage to the tight end position. The average advantage still exists with quarterbacks, whereas it's disappearing with the tight end position. You can see those third bullet points there, possibly even becoming a disadvantage for the Tier 2 tight ends against the rest of the tight end pool of players that you're most likely going to be seen in against on a week in and week out basis. The matchup advantage, those final bullet points, the drop-off is greater for the tight end position from the Tier 1 tight end to the Tier 2 tight end than it is for the quarterback position, which one could argue that that's a tip in the cap towards the quarterback position, which would make this an advantage second-tier quarterback as well. And I do think there is a slight advantage for the Tier 2 quarterbacks when you look at these numbers. However, when you take into effect that you're looking down the line towards what you're giving up, the Tier 2 quarterback position fares better off than the Tier 2 tight end position. Thus, when forced to make a decision between the two, I think that the tie goes towards the tight end, especially in terms of taking earlier on in the draft, a Tier 1 tight end over a Tier 1 quarterback. If you're looking at 2 guys that you think could both be in those tiers, I think the tie goes towards the tight end. Well, I just kind of went over this slide, so I think we can just move on to the next slide, and that's going to bring us on to the Fantasy Pros website here. We'll start off with the quarterback position, just looking at how I break down the tiers from the Fantasy Pros website. For the quarterbacks, I think that I can safely say that I think that the first tier is going to be Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Jalen Hurts, and Lamar Jackson. So just a group of 4 here. Out of this tier, none of them, I don't really have any busts. I'm perfectly fine with where each is going in terms of against one another within the tier. I have different rankings, but I understand they could be jumbled up in any which way, and it's tough to argue against it. However, I do have a target, and that's mostly because of him being at the back of this tier via ADP. That's Lamar Jackson. If I can get him, a full round or 2 later than these guys, I'm going to take him because I think he has just as good a shot as being the quarterback 1 when all is said and done at the end of the season as any of these guys do. When it comes to the tier 2 quarterbacks, obviously we're going to start off at quarterback 12 at 5, and I'm going to go to quarterback 12. However, I'm going to talk a little bit more deeper here. If I'm being totally exclusive, that's my tier. If we want to be a little bit more inclusive, probably technically a little bit more realistic, I think we could go all the way to quarterback 14 or 15, even 16. I could argue. So just a heads up on that. I'll keep these highlighted, but those guys are in the argument. We'll talk about them, some of them, a little bit here. In terms of a sleeper in this group or a primary target for me, that's going to be Jaden Daniels. I just think the value on him is the best, really, out of any of these guys. I don't even want to call these guys targets because they're not necessarily targets of mine, because I'd rather attack that value and attack other positions at this point in the draft. But Anthony Richardson and Joe Burrow Anthony Richardson's kind of a target of mine, but him and Joe Burrow are both guys who I like the most out of this tier. I think both of them have really good chances of definitely coming through for you with where they're getting taken in the draft. And I'm confident in that. I have the most concern about Dak Prescott coming through for you where you're taking him in the draft. He could definitely overperform. We've seen that plenty of times. But this is just a team in Dallas that it just doesn't seem like it's going to be a fantastic year. At the same time, there's enough there. Dak Prescott's good enough that maybe it'll be perfectly fine. I really don't know what to expect. Then if we were to be more inclusive and we were to include like a Jared Goff here and a Tua Tagovailoa specifically, I think the hope for these guys performing better than they did last year in fantasy and more consistently is that they run the ball into the end zone as a team, not the individuals here, although that wouldn't be a bad thing either. But more or less, they run the ball into the end zone less as a team. The running backs get fewer touchdowns, and they rely on the pass more. The quarterbacks throw for more touchdowns. But the thing is, with these teams and how they like to operate, I just don't know that that's something that I'm going to totally bank on happening. It could easily happen. I don't know that I want to bank on it, in which case, to me, they're more like borderline quarterback 3 guys, which is going to put him in the same pool, which is typically where I have him roughly, in the same pool as the Aaron Rodgers, Kirk Cousins, Matt Stafford, the really good quarterbacks who are maybe past their prime or roughly that's the story there with those guys. So they still are going to be like consistent, but just the ceiling isn't there. And so for different reasons, I think Jared Goff just might be inconsistently very good. Let's look at the tight end position here. Let's get this to half PPR scoring. At my first tier for tight ends, shocker, it's going to be the top 5 tight ends. Travis Kelce, Sam Laporta, Trey McBride, Mark Andrews, Dalton Kincaid. Similarly to how I talked about the tight end target being the last one in the group because of the value. And because I thought that Lamar Jackson has just as good of a chance as anybody in that group as being the quarterback 1 when all is said and done. Dalton Kincaid, I don't think the odds of him being the tight end 1 are really any bit lower than any of these guys in this tier. So he is my target of the group. My second tier, I could be exclusive yet again and say it's George Kittle just to Jake Ferguson, and that's it. I do have that as like a little second tier of mine. But if we want to be a little bit more inclusive, I could open this up to say all the way down to Dallas Goedert, or I could include Hawkinson, Schultz, maybe even go as far as going all the way from 6 to 16, Cole Kmet, which is more realistically what it'll look like statistically at the end of the year. However, coming into the draft, to me, there's these 4 have a certain level of confidence that I don't have with the rest of those guys. So we'll look at the big picture here from tight end 16 on down. And for me in this tier, my biggest concern for being a bust on where you have to take him amongst others and within the draft amongst all positions is David Njoku. I would much rather be taking him, around Dallas Goedert area. A lot of questions, inconsistent, assumptions that they'll be inconsistent, but also definite upside that, if realized, could make them a good value. I do have optimism for Dalton Schultz, somebody who, because of the target share, I'm all in all concerned about the consistency of him as a tight end, but we know that we shouldn't care about consistency as much. But throughout the preseason, he's been really targeted heavily while the number ones for this offense have been out there. So that's been a very promising sign preseason, but still promising. And in terms of concern, guys I have concern for, I'm going to be looking at the guys who are lower here. Pat Freiermuth, Cole Kmet, specifically for Pat Freiermuth. Actually, in both cases, they've been sharing tight end 1 duties with someone else. So for Pat Freiermuth, it's been with Darnell Washington, second-year tight end. And we have a new offensive coordinator here in Arthur Smith, who, although he's been good for tight ends, typically he's not always been good for the tight end that we've wanted him to be good for in fantasy. Remember last year, Jonnu Smith was outperforming against Kyle Pitts a lot of the time. Is that going to be Darnell Washington this year over Pat Freiermuth? I don't know, but apparently they're sharing a fair amount of that work. And for Cole Kmet, apparently he's been sharing a great amount of work with Gerald Everett, which makes enough sense. Gerald Everett's a really good veteran, does all the small things well, great coaching that he's had as well. So I get that, but that's obviously going to impact how much you can rely on Cole Kmet and what kind of ceiling he has, as well as the inconsistency week to week. So that's going to bring us on to a couple of sleeper breakout candidates here, looking outside of the tiers. If you don't like anybody there, if you miss out on them, who are my favorite guys? And there's other people I can make arguments for here, right? But my top tiers, Noah Fant, going as the tight end 24. He should be a good fit for the Ryan Grubb offense, new offensive coordinator in town there in Seattle. They gave him a new contract this offseason, and he has said good things about Ryan Grubb. So we've seen both player and team show some appreciation for each other's skill sets, whatever. And usually if a player is saying they really like this new offense, especially if there's somebody who catches the ball as part of their living, that probably means that they're really involved in catching the ball in their duties, and they're enjoying that. So I think really good signs for Noah Fant that he's going to be a big part of this offense. Zach Ertz going as tight end 32, basically not being drafted, right? Well, I really don't understand this. I gotta say, at the very minimum, I don't understand it against Juwan Johnson, Jatavian Sanders, Greg Dulcich, Dawson Knox, Chig, maybe Ben Sinnott, Hunter Henry, Isaiah Likely, technically, although he's, I do understand that at least. So those other guys, I really don't understand it against any of them. He should be going higher, even if it's still in that undrafted-ish territory, back end. He should be a last round of the draft type of tight end that somebody's taking a shot on. He is familiar with this Cliff Kingsbury offense, their offensive coordinator there in Washington, as they were together in Arizona, where over 9 full games, Ertz averaged 5 receptions for 43 yards and 4 touchdowns. Now you say, that doesn't sound like a whole lot, right? 43 yards, 5 receptions, 4 touchdowns over 9 games. You forget how bad tight ends really are compared to other positions. That comes to roughly 9.5 fantasy points per game, which if you look at average fantasy points per game in 2023 and 2021 would have been the tight end 8, and in 2022 would have been the tight end 5. So we're looking at a top 10 tight end likelihood here for Zach Ertz. I know a little bit older, coming off of some injury. Also, he is the clear-cut tight end 1 on a team with a rookie quarterback. Rookie quarterbacks tend to like tight ends. This offensive system tends to like tight ends. He's familiar with it. A lot of reasons to think high floor for Zach Ertz. And, great, at a very minimum, I think a very great backup tight end for you to have. But for whatever reason, just not getting any buzz again this year. I find it insane. But age, maybe I'll be proven wrong. And then a little trio here of guys who the odds are that they're average, but there's a chance that they're going to be better than average. It's Jonnu Smith, Mike Gesicki, Hayden Hurst. I think all of them, if they were to be those borderline, like top 18 type of tight ends, could make a lot of sense, even if better. But historically, the teams, the offenses that they've been on themselves have just kind of led to average results. So I'm not expecting too much from them, but they're in fine possible situations. I missed saving one of the slides here for this little slideshow. So tier 1 quarterbacks, tier 1 tight ends, both of them are going off of the board between rounds 2 and 4. Borderline tier 1 quarterbacks, borderline, well, the tight ends are not borderline, but borderline round 5 guys include CJ Stroud, Anthony Richardson. I'd say technically, based on what I presented, they were tier 2, but I have Anthony Richardson in my tier 1, CJ Stroud just outside of it. So both of them getting taken possibly in the 4th round, possibly early 5th round. And then Mark Andrews, Dalton Kincaid for the tight end position, tier 1 tight ends. They might make it into the 5th round. In some instances, they might even make it lower. Dalton Kincaid made it into the 6th round in my home league fantasy draft. But typically, where they're getting taken, they're going to be off the board by early 5th round. And that's going to be your tier 1 quarterbacks and tight ends all off of the board by that point. Which brings us to your tier 2 players for both positions by the time we're getting into the 6th round here, where you would see 4 quarterbacks getting taken and roughly 5 tight ends getting taken. And in round 8, you might see a quarterback get taken, you might see a tight end get taken, but you also might not. So there's a little bit of, at some point in round 7 or so, you're going to see the quarterbacks and the tight ends start to slow down as far as how often they're getting drafted. And then things start to pick up first for the quarterback position in round 9, where you're going to see 4 to 5, almost half of the players gone in a 12-team 12-team league. Almost half of the players off the board in round 9 are going to be quarterbacks. The end of a tier here, the top 2 tiers are going to be gone. And this includes, obviously, Jaden Daniels right there at the edge of that, at the end of that. So round 9, I think, is a really sweet spot to get your quarterbacks. And for the tight ends, this works out nicely enough. 1 to 2 tight ends you're expecting to go in the 9th round. And then the last of your top 2-tier tight ends also going off of the board by round 11. 10 and 11, they're going, but by the end of the 11th round, you would expect your tier 2 tight ends to be gone. So you can be a little bit patient at each of these positions depending on exactly what your thoughts are on the players. I'll get a little bit into this in just a moment, but remember, tier 2 quarterbacks technically could start in round 5, but rounds 6 through 9 are where you're going to see those quarterbacks getting taken. And tier 2 tight ends are going to go anywhere from round 6 through 11. So that, once again, practice some patience there. Round 6, 7, 8, maybe 9, 10, even in some situations. It's perfectly fine to do. And that brings us to, I want blank out of my blank, top blank tight ends. So let me just pull up my rankings here real quick for the tight end position. And I said that I prefer to get one of my first tier tight ends, the Sam Laporta through Dalton Kincaid group. I'm happy to settle for Jake Ferguson, my 9th ranked tight end, or Evan Ingram, my 6th ranked tight end, who you just have to get a little bit earlier. And I find that that's an area of the draft where usually there's some running backs that I might like, or maybe a wide receiver has fallen, so I end up usually passing on Evan Ingram. But Jake Ferguson, the 10th round there, extremely happy to get him there if he's available. And I'm also happy to just take a couple of tight ends at the end of the draft that I missed out on the top tier on. And I talked about, those guys, the Noah Fants, Zach Ertz there at tight end 17. It's tough to put Pat Freiermuth, Cole Kmet lower in my rankings, but I don't know. I really want to. I do. That's a tough little area to what order to put them in. And for the quarterback, I'm a little bit more laissez-faire even than the tight ends. In general, at least to start off with, I want one of my top 15 quarterbacks is really what it comes down to. And Anthony Richardson, I think, would be really fun to have. And obviously, I have him ranked 4th, so I think that he is a slight value in terms of where he's getting taken against other quarterbacks. 1 spot difference, right? But I'm just not going to force the issue. There are other things that I think might be more important to get off of the board at that point in the draft. So tight ends, I prefer tight end 1. A tier 1 tight end, I'm not going to push the matter. I'll settle for Evan Ingram or Ferguson. And if I miss out on a tier 1 tight end, I'm absolutely happy to punt the position and take advantage of some guys who I can get really at the end of the draft. For the quarterback position, one of my top 15. AR could be fun, but I do find that Jaden Daniels is going to be the best value if I don't, get somebody by that point in the draft that has fallen, which can always happen. Happened in my home draft. I ended up with Kyler Murray. In terms of historical information on the quarterbacks and tight ends, a lot of it is stuff that we just know as a fantasy community. There wasn't too much craziness, but I do want to say, don't forget, the quarterback's success leans into consistency. That was part of my analysis. What I found out was consistency does matter at the quarterback position, and this is a good argument for a player like Patrick Mahomes, who we know can be very highly consistent. Typically, he has been throughout his career. But rushing quarterbacks also tend to be quite consistent in the modern NFL, and that's because the rushing yards are 2.5 times more valuable than the passing yards. Rushing touchdowns in a lot of formats are 1.5 times more valuable than passing touchdowns. And so when these guys are getting 20, 30, 40 more rushing yards than every other quarterback, one rushing touchdown every other week or so, not only does that raise the ceiling, but that also raises the floor for these guys, because those, you just need fewer yards to get more fantasy points. It just works out like that. So Patrick Mahomes is one of the only guys who can pass at such a high efficiency and get so many passing touchdowns and pass so much that his consistency still holds up against even the rushing quarterbacks to most seasons to some extent. For the tight end position, I found that consistency really doesn't help you win week in and week out. The boom-bust nature of the tight end is so great. They're so inconsistent that to some extent, I'll point out in a little bit, you can kind of just close your eyes, pick a guy, go with it, and your odds aren't like the worst in the world that you'll beat your opponent's tight end. So this leads to arguments in favor of guys like George Kittle and probably, unfortunately, Taysom Hill as well, if you can put him in your tight end spot, as to why they, across the entirety of the season, even though they may not help you win several games, are going to end up helping you win quite a few games as well. So that's going to bring us on to the injury factor, which is always something to keep in mind. For the quarterback position, we know, historically, quarterbacks have been a very healthy position. The NFL invests in quarterbacks with a lot of money, and therefore they've made a lot of rules in order to protect their investments, and thus they have become, typically, most years, they're going to be a good investment for you in fantasy football. You can rely on them to stay relatively healthy compared to every other position. Last 2 years, we have seen a lot of injuries for the quarterback position. We'll see if that's most likely. That should be just kind of a bump in the road. But and it's definitely something that the NFL is going to work to prevent from continuing to happen, whatever the issue is that's caused that. So we see that happen for a third year. I'm still not too concerned about that being true for the long-term expectations for the following year of the health of the quarterback position. In terms of replacing a quarterback that goes down for you, if you had a tier 1 quarterback, it is possible. This is really the only position where it is possible to replace one of those top tier guys with some amount of expectation. Generally speaking, you have over a 1 in 3 chance of getting a direct or a good replacement, and there's a 60% chance of getting a not bad replacement out of the production from your, not bad production from your replacement. A good replacement being, one of those top, I would say like 3 tiers, and there's this 4th tier of quarterbacks who are not great, but they're not bad yet, and then there's this small section of like 5 quarterbacks on a weekly basis and like 3 or 4 at the end of the season out of the your starting 32 who are legit like bad fantasy quarterbacks. There's not many that are bad, and there's a pretty good chance when there's a new quarterback coming into play for a team that they're not even going to be bad. Backup quarterbacks usually aren't bad. You might find a 2021 Tyler Huntley or a last year's Joe Flacco. They happen each and every year. For the tight end position, you're looking at a 50% chance of a highly healthy season, meaning fully healthy throughout the entirety of the season or only missing one game. A length of injury, somewhere between the health of the running back position and the wide receiver position, coming to about 13 healthy games throughout the entire season, missing 3 or 4 of them. And you can close your eyes and pick a replacement. In my analysis from a couple of years ago, I found that when a tight end went down, there was anywhere between a 1 in 5 to a 1 in 3 chance of beating your opponent. So let's just say a 25% chance in any given week, whether you're facing an elite tight end or not, that your tight end would outperform that tight end. You could just close your eyes and choose a tight end, and your odds were somewhere between 1 in 5, 1 in 3. And when we look at strategy, I'm just going to look at early, mid, tier 1, tier 2, or punting the position is essentially how I'm looking at this for both the quarterbacks and the tight ends. For the quarterback position, the top tier quarterbacks, I'm going to reluctantly pass on them. I do like these guys, and I do think like Lamar Jackson in the 4th round is fine value. There's just other things I'd rather do with my roster, and there are some guys later on down the position that I would rather attack and think I have a pretty good shot at getting with relatively not even having to be overly aggressive. Throughout the mid rounds, I'm just going to kind of pass on these guys, rounds 5 through 8. There's just guys who I think have just as good a shot of outperforming them that I can get, once again, shortly. And all in all, when it comes to the quarterback position, I am not planning on punting this position completely. I do think that we have a relatively good grasp on the order that we're drafting these quarterbacks off of the board. So I really do want to be attacking that late 8th round, 9th round at that point in the draft to get one of those quarterbacks. And if it means I have to punt, if I do miss out there, I am happy to get an Aaron Rodgers and a Matt Stafford, and I think I can make it work, but it's not my goal. That's going to bring us on to the strategy for the tight end position, and I have targets, all over the draft for the tight end position that I'm ready to take if they fall to me. And if they don't fall at any point in the draft, I'm okay with it. I'm okay with punting the position at the end of the day, basically. But the first time that a tight end does fall, I'm going to do my best to scoop them up. Depends on the rest of the board, depends on my roster. If I went 0 RB and there's a really good RB sitting there still in the 6th round that I really love, I guess I'll pass up on the Dalton Kincaid that fell to me in the 6th round. But generally speaking, I'll take advantage when one of my tight end targets falls. Otherwise, I'll just take my Noah Fant and Zach Ertz combo at the end of the draft or something like, 2 sleepers of mine, and I feel pretty good about it anyways. I'm not feeling like I missed out on too much. That is it for the tight ends and the quarterbacks. Thank you very, very much. Look forward to seeing a lot of you for some live mock drafting throughout next week. Position videos will be coming out with my final draft rankings, and the season's almost here, folks, so this is really exciting. Can't wait to get going. And if you're not aware, throughout the season I will be live plenty of the times to help you with your weekly start sit type of decisions, and I do weekly rankings and waiver wire videos, etc., all the good stuff. So peace out, see you soon, bye bye.